Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and uncover a truly fascinating, hidden architectural secret of the United States. We so often think of the American Republic as this entirely modern invention, something born purely out of 18th century Enlightenment philosophy. But, as we're going to see today, the political imagination of the founding generation was actually fundamentally shaped by a single ancient Greek author, Plutarch.
We all know the iconic lines, right? Patrick Henry boldly declaring, "Give me liberty or give me death," back in 1775. Or think about Nathan Hale's famous tragic regret right before his execution about having but one life to lose for his country. These are literally the foundational quotes of American history. They're carved into our monuments and deeply ingrained in our cultural memory. But there's a hidden history behind these words that completely changes how we view the American Revolution.
Because here is the absolute bombshell. Those famous quotes, they were not entirely original thoughts. No way. Patrick Henry's cry for liberty was actually a direct citation of Plutarch's moral types, specifically Cato the Younger at Utica and Brutus at Philippi. And Nathan Hale's famous last words, well, they were just a paraphrase from a play about that exact same Plutarchan hero, Cato. So the political rhetoric of the American Revolution is, to a really striking extent, ancient Plutarchan rhetoric that was repurposed for the 18th century.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover the secret founding blueprint, how they chose their ancient heroes, the four pillars of the Republic, Plutarch's influence beyond the founding generation, and finally, your modern moral inheritance.
Section 1. The secret founding blueprint, rooted in the 18th century schoolroom. To really understand this inheritance, we have to travel back to those Latin school classrooms. If you were a young, educated boy back then, Plutarch's biographies were basically your ultimate manual for public character. You read his plain prose right alongside other classical giants like Cicero and Tacitus. It was treated as biography, sure, but mostly as the perfect practical guide for forming moral seriousness. In fact, John Adams once wrote to his son in 1781 that you would find Plutarch in the hands of literally every American boy of sense. Moving to Section 2, choosing their ancient heroes, which led to a real clash of ideals. Because as these young boys grew into the founding generation, they actually adopted these ancient avatars to guide their political lives in the real world. This divide is just fascinating. John Adams, for instance, constantly compared himself to the great orator Cicero. But his fierce rival, Alexander Hamilton, totally different story. Hamilton preferred Julius Caesar. He was deeply attracted to this figure of the brilliant outsider rising to executive power, and he even imitated Plutarchan character sketches in his own writing. Thomas Jefferson used to accuse Hamilton of wanting to be Caesar. And the crazy part is, Hamilton actually found the comparison flattering. All right, Section 3, the four pillars of the Republic. What exactly did the founders take from Plutarch? Well, they extracted four highly specific tools from Plutarch to build this new republic from scratch. They didn't just read his biographies as ancient history, they treated them as a practical manual. So let's break each of these down and see how they shaped the nation. The first pillar was the figure of the perfect citizen statesman. Plutarch's heroes, guys like Camillus, weren't professional politicians like we have today. They followed an exact four-step sequence. They take office reluctantly, perform honorably, refuse a crown or a third term, and then retire to private life. And guess who consciously imitated this exact sequence perfectly? George Washington. His legendary refusal to take a third term, stepping away from power to return to his farm, his outright refusal to be made a king, these are textbook Plutarchan moves. His contemporaries recognized it too. Washington was playing the role of the ancient hero to absolute perfection. On the flip side, we have the second pillar, the danger of the brilliant, ambitious man. The founders were absolutely terrified of Caesar types rising up in their own ranks, so they actually weaponized Plutarch against each other. Adams and Jefferson used the specter of Caesar to attack Hamilton, while Hamilton's own friends used the chaotic, ambitious Alcibiades to express their fears about Aaron Burr. They literally used these ancient warning portraits as their exact political vocabulary. The third pillar they extracted is this amazing mental framework called synkresis. It basically means the discipline of comparison. Plutarch famously wrote his biographies in pairs, a Greek and a Roman, and then weighed them against each other. This wasn't just some literary trick. It fundamentally shaped how the founders thought, how they argued, and how they judged different political arrangements by looking at specific historical incidents. To see synkresis in action, we just have to look at James Madison's Federalist 10. While the Federalist Papers obviously aren't formatted like a Plutarch biography, Madison's famous essay on factions is entirely Plutarchian in spirit. It's a total masterclass in Republican comparison, actively weighing the political arrangements of ancient Sparta, ancient Rome, and modern Britain to craft one of the most important political arguments in American history.
And the fourth, and honestly perhaps most vital pillar, was the legitimation of revolutionary action itself. I mean, how do you logically justify overthrowing a king? Well, the founders used the Plutarchian example of Brutus killing the tyrant Caesar as their clear moral precedent. In their minds, Brutus had the right to depose his former benefactor for the sake of the city. Therefore, the American colonies had the exact same moral right to depose their monarch for their own sake. Much of the entire case for the American Revolution was built directly on this ancient precedent. Section 4. Beyond the founding generation. The continuing influence. Because this ancient DNA didn't simply vanish the second the revolutionary dust settled. Tracing this timeline right into the 19th century, we see Plutarch's influence flow directly into the minds of writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Emerson even wrote essays on Plutarch in 1850, and eventually this flows right to Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s, who deeply embedded that exact same Plutarchian citizen-statesman ideal straight into his addresses. It's absolutely fascinating when you actually look at Lincoln's core reading list. It consisted of 3 main books: the Bible, Shakespeare, and Plutarch. That is the exact same trio, in roughly the exact same order of importance, that Adams and Jefferson were reading decades earlier. The intellectual torch was passed on seamlessly. And that brings us to Section 5, your modern moral inheritance, a continuous thread. Now you might be wondering, how did these early Americans reconcile ancient pagan texts with their modern religious beliefs? You'd think there would be a massive conflict between 18th century Christian or deist beliefs and ancient Greek pagan models, right? But the founders saw absolutely no tension there. Plutarch's moral seriousness appealed to them universally. Whether they were devout Christians or more secular deists, they just wove these texts together. They read Plutarch, St. Augustine, the Bible, and Cicero not as competing ideologies, but as a single continuous moral inheritance. They merged them all into this beautiful, unified tradition of public virtue, republican simplicity, and the citizen soldier. And that continuous American political vocabulary, our deep respect for the citizen soldier, our refusal of monarchy, our ideals of public virtue, all of that flows right through Plutarch. While the modern American Republic may not consciously sit down and read him much anymore, our entire political imagination still heavily relies on his blueprint. You are standing in the middle of this inheritance right now. So the question only you can answer is, if the blueprint of American democracy was drawn up in ancient Greece and Rome, what other ancient secrets are hiding in plain sight today?